Well, hello. How you doing? It is I, your crimson-colored C word that is also a reader. Hey guys, how you doing? We are going to continue with The Hobbit. Tonight is Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders. So guys, if you have questions or anything else, go ahead, chime in whenever you feel like it. And here we go. Flies and spiders. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a sort of arch leading into a gloomy tunnel made by two great trees that leant against each other. Too old and strangled with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves. The path itself was narrow and wound in and out among the trunks. Soon the light at the gate was a little bright hole far behind, and it was so quiet and deep that their feet seemed to thump along. The trees leaned over them and listened. I forgot to check, make sure I got everything rolling right. Okay, everything looks good. Okay. Their eyes became used to the dimness as they could see a little to the either side of the sort of a darkened green glimmer. Occasionally, a slender beam of sun that had the luck to slip in through some opening in the leaves that far above, and still more luck in not being caught in the tangled boughs and matted twigs beneath, stabbed down thin and bright before them. This was the seldom, and it soon ceased altogether. So it's a dark woods, basically. One sec. Just heard a crash outside, making sure everything's okay. Alright. There were black squirrels in the woods. Black squirrels. As Bilbo's sharp, inquisitive eyes got used to seeing things, he could catch glimpses of them, whisking off the path and scuttling behind tree trunks. There were strange noises, too, grunts, scufflings, and hurryings in the undergrowth, and among the leaves that lay piled endlessly thick in place on the forest floor. But what made the noises he could not see. The nasty things they saw were the cobwebs, dark, dense cobwebs, with threads extraordinarily thick. That's a big word! Whew! Often stretched from tree to tree or tangled in the lower branches on either side of them. There were none stretched across the path, but whether because of some magic kept it clear, or for some other reason they could not guess. It was not long before they grew to hate the forest as heartily as they had hated the tunnels of the goblins, and seemed to offer even less hope at any ending. But they had to go on and on, long after they were sick of sight of the sun and for the sky, and longed for the feel of wind on their faces. There was no movement of air down under the forest roof, and it was everlastingly still and dark and stuffy. Even the dwarves felt it, who were used to tunneling and living at times for long whiles without the light of the sun, but the hobbit, who liked holes to make a house in, but not to spend summer days in, felt that he was being slowly suffocated. The nights were the worst. It then became pitch black. Not what you would call pitch dark, but really pitch. So black that you could really see nothing. Bilbo tried flapping his hand in front of his nose, but he could not see it at all. Perhaps it was not true they say that you could see nothing. They could see eyes. They slept all closely huddled together and took in turns to watch, and when it was Bilbo's turn, he would see gleams in the darkness around him. And sometimes pairs of yellow or red or green eyes would stare at him from a little distance, and then slowly fade and disappear and slowly shine out again in another place. And sometimes they would gleam down from the branches just above him, and that was the most terrifying. But the eyes that he liked the least were horrible, pale, bulbous sort of eyes. Insect eyes, he thought, not animal eyes. Only they are much too big. Although it was not yet very cold, they tried lighting watchfires at night, but they soon gave it up. It seemed to bring hundreds and hundreds of eyes all around them, though the creatures, wherever they were careful never to let their bodies show in the little light of flicker of flame. What still it brought worst thousands of dark gray and black moths, some nearly as big as your hand, flapping and whirling around your ears. They could not stand that, nor huge bats, black as the top hat, either, so they gave up fires, sat at night, and dozed in the enormous, uncanny darkness. I'm going to imagine it's kind of like that one portion of the Haunted Mansion where you could see these eyes painted on the wall on both sides of you, and some of them are blinking, and some of them seem to be like coming in and out. It's probably a lot like that. All of this went on for what seemed to the Hobbit ages upon ages, and he was always hungry, for there was extremely careful with their provisions. And so as days followed, and still the forest seemed just the same, they began to get anxious. The food would not last forever, and it was in fact already beginning to get low. They tried shooting at the squirrels, and they wasted many arrows before they managed to bring one down on the path. But when they roasted it, it proved horrible to taste, and they shot no more squirrels. Plus, I guess if you're a dwarf, a squirrel could give you a little bit of meat, but... They were thirsty too, for they had none too much water, and the time they seemed neither spring nor stream. This was their state. One day they found their path blocked by a running water. It flowed fast and strong, but was not very wide to cross the way, and it was black, or looked in the gloom. It was well that Bjorn had warned them against it, or they would have drunk from it, whether its color or filled from some emptied skins at the bank. And it was they only thought of how it could cross without wetting themselves in its water. They had been a bridge of wood across, but it had been rotten and fallen, leaving only the broken posts near the bank. Bilbo kneeled to the brink and peering forward, cried, "This is the boat against the far bank." Not only could it have been on his side. "How far could you think it is?" said Thorin, for by now they knew Bilbo had the sharpest eyes among them. "Not at all far. I shouldn't think above another 12 yards. 12 yards? I should have thought it 30 at least. But at least my eyes don't see as well as they used 100 years ago. 100 years ago? Wow. How old is Thorin? Still, 12 yards is still as well as a mile. We can't jump it, and we daren't try to swade or swim. Can any of you throw a rope? What's the good of that? The boat is sure to be tied up, even if we could hook it, which I doubt. I don't believe it's tied, said Bilbo, though of course I can't be sure in this light. It looks to me as if it was just drawn up onto the bank, which is low, just there on the path that goes down into the water. Dori is the strongest, but Fili is the youngest and has the best sight, says Thorin. Come here, Fili, and see if you can see the boat Mr. Baggins is talking about. Fili thought he could, or so when he started a long while to get an idea of the direction. The others brought him a rope. They had several with them, and they were on the end of the longest they fashioned, one of the large iron hooks they had used for catching their packs to the strap about their shoulder. Fili took this in his hand and bounced it for a moment, and then flung it across the stream. Splash! It fell into the water. Not far enough, said Bilbo, who was peering forward. A couple of feet, and you would have dropped it in the boat. Try again. I don't suppose the magic is strong enough to hurt you if you just touch it a wee bit of wet rope. Fili picked up the hook when he saw they had drawn it back rather undoubtedly all the same. This time he threw it with great strength. Steady, said Bilbo. You had thrown it right into the wood on the other side. Draw it back gently. Fili hauled the rope back slowly, and after a while Bilbo said, carefully, it's lying on the boat. Let's hope the hook will catch it. And it did. The rope went taut, and Fili pulled in vain. Kili came to his help, and then Oin and Gloin. They tugged, and suddenly they all fell over on their backs. Bilbo was on the lookout, however, caught the rope, and with a piece of stick fended off the little black boat as if it came rushing towards the stream. Help! He shouted, and Balin just in time came to seize the boat before it floated off down the stream. It was tied after all, said he, looking at the snap painter, and that was still dangling from it. That was a good pull, my lads, and a good job that our rope was the stronger. Who'll cross first? Asked Bilbo. I shall, said Thorin, and you shall come with me, Fili and Balin. That's as many as the boat will hold at a time. After that, Kili and Oin and Gloin and Dori. Next, Ori and Nori, Bifur and Bofer. Last, Dwalin and Bomber. I'm always the last and I don't like it, said Bomber. It's somebody else's turn today. You shouldn't be so fat. As you are, you might be the last and lightest boatload. Don't start grumbling against orders or something bad will happen to you. There aren't any oars. How do you expect to push the boat back to the far brink? Asked the Hobbit. Give me another length of rope and another hook, said Fili. And when they had gotten to it already, he cast into the darkness ahead and high as he could. Since it did not fall down again, they saw it must have got stuck in the branches. Get it now, said Fili, and one of you haul it on the rope and that is stuck in the tree on the other side. One of the others will keep hold of the hook we used at first, and we are safe on the other side. He can hook it on, and you can draw the boat back. So, little game of elevator, back and forth. In this way, they were all soon on the far bank, safe across the enchanted stream. Dwalin had just scrambled out the coiled rope on his arm, and Bomber, still grumbling, was getting ready to follow, when something bad did happen. There was a flying sound of hooves on the path ahead. Out of the gloom came suddenly the shape of a flying deer. It charged into the dwarves and bowled them over, then gathered itself for a leap. High it sprang and cleared the water with a mighty jump, but it did not reach the other side in safety. Thorin was the only one who had kept his feet and his wits. As soon as he had landed, it had bent his bow and fitted an arrow in case any sudden guardian of the boat appeared. Now he sent a swift and sure shot into the leaping beast. As it reached the bank, it stumbled. The shadows swallowed it up, but they heard the sound of hooves quickly falter and then go still. Before they could shout the praise of the shot, however, a dreadful wail from Bilbo put all thoughts of venison out of their mouths and their minds. Bomber has fallen in! Bomber is drowning! He cried. It was only too true. Bomber was only 1 foot on the lawn when the heart broke down on him and sprang over him. He had stumbled, thrusting the boat back from the bank, and then tumbled back into the dark water, his hands slipping off the slimy rocks on the edge, while the boat span slowly off and disappeared. They could still see his hood above the water when they ran to the bank. Quickly they flung a rope with a hook towards him. His hand caught it, and when they pulled him to shore, he was drenched, from hair to boots, of course. But that was not the worst. When they laid him on the bank, he was already fast asleep, with one hand clutching the rope so tightly that they could not get it from his grasp. And fast asleep he remained in spite all they could do. They were still standing over him, cursing their ill luck and Bomber's clumsiness, and lamenting the loss of the boat, which made it impossible for them to go back and hook for the heart when they were aware of the dim blowing of horns in the woods and the sound of a dog baying far off. Then they all fell silent, and they all sat. It seemed they could hear a noise in the great hunt going by the north of the path, though they saw no sign of it. There they sat for a long while and did not dare to make a move. Bomber slept on with a smile on his fat face, as if he no longer cared for all the troubles that vexed him. Suddenly the path ahead appeared with some white deer, a hind and fawns as snowy white as the heart had been dark. They glimmered in the shadows. Before Thorin could cry out, 3 of the dwarves had leapt to their feet and loosed off arrows from their bows. None seemed to find their mark. The deer turned and vanished in the trees, and silently as they had come, in the vain, the dwarves shot their arrows after them. "Stop! Stop!" shouted Thorin, but it was too late. The excited dwarves had wasted their last arrows, and now the bows that Bjorn had given them were useless. There was a gloomy party that night, and the glooms gathered deeper on them for the following days. They had crossed the enchanted stream, but beyond it the path seemed to struggle on just as before, and in the forest they could see no change. Yet they had known more about it and considered the meaning of the hunt and the white deer that appeared upon in the path, and they would have known that they were the very last towards the eastern edge. It would soon have come if they could have kept up their courage and their hope. Two thinner trees, the place where the sunlight came again. But they did not know this, and they were burdened with the heavy body of Bumber, which they had to carry along with them as best they could, taking the wearisome task of turns of 4 each, while the others shared their packs. If these had not been all too light in the last few days, they would never have managed it. But a slumbering and smiling Bumber was a poor exchange for packs filled with food, however heavy. In a few days, a time came when there was practically nothing left to eat or drink. Nothing wholesome could they see growing in the wood, only funguses and herbs and pale leaves and unpleasant smell. Ugh, you ever walk around a wet foliage and whatever? Ugh. After 4 days from the enchanted stream, they came to a part where most of the trees were breaches. They were at first inclined to cheer by the change, for here there was no undergrowth, and the shadow was not so deep. There was a greenish light about them, and in the places they could not see some distance to either side of the path, yet the only light showed them endless lines of straight gray trunks, like pillars of some huge twilight hall. There was a breath of air and a noise of wind, but it had a sad sound. A few leaves came rustling down to remind them that autumn was coming on. Their feet ruffled through the dead leaves, and countless other autumns had drifted over the banks of the path from the deep red carpets of the forest. Still, Bomber slept, and they grew very weary. At times they were They heard disquieting laughter. What is disquieting, I wonder? Because it's not quiet and it's not dissing. The laughter was the laughter of far voices, not of goblins, and the singing was beautiful, but it sounded eerie and strange, and there was not comfort, rather than hurried on from those part from which the strength they had left. 2 days later, they found their path going downward, and before long they were in the valley filled almost entirely with a mighty growth of oak. "Is there no end to this accursed forest?" said Thorn. "Somebody climb a tree and see if he can get on his head above the roof and have a look around. The only way is the closest of the tallest tree that overhangs the path." Of course, somebody means Bilbo. They chose him because to be of any use of a climber must get his head above the topmost leaves, and so he must be light enough for the heaviest and slenderest branches to bear him. Poor Mr. Baggins had never had much practice in climbing trees, but they hoisted him up into the lowest branches of an enormous oak that grew right out of the path, and up he had to go as best he could. He pushed his way through the tangled twigs, and many slap in the eye. He was greened and grimmed from the old bark on the greater boughs. More than once he slipped and caught himself just in time, and at last had a dreadful struggle in a difficult place where he seemed to be. There was no convenient branches at all, and he had gotten near the top. All the time he was wondering where there were spiders in the tree and how he was going to get down again, except for falling. In the end, he poked his head above the roof of leaves, and then he found spiders all right, but they were only small ones of ordinary size, and they were after the butterflies. Bilbo's eyes were nearly blinded by the light. He could hear the dwarf shouting up from far below, but he could not answer, only hold on and blink. The sun was shining brilliantly, and it was a long while before he could bear it. When he could, he saw all around him in a sea of dark green, ruffled here and there by the breeze, and there was everywhere hundreds of butterflies. I expect a kind of purple emperor, a butterfly that loves the top of oak woods, but these were not purple at all. They were dark, velvety black, without markings to be seen. He looked at the black emperors for a long time, and enjoyed the feel of the breeze in his hair and on his face. But at length the cries of the dwarfs were now simply stamping with impatience down below, reminded him of his real business. It was no good. Gaze as much as he might, he could see no end of the trees and the leaves in any direction. His heart, that had been lighted by the sight of the sun and the feel of the wind, sank back into his toes. There was no food to go back down below. Actually, as I have told you, they were not far off the edge of the forest, and if Bilbo had the sense to see it, the tree that he had climbed, though it was tall in itself, was standing near the bottom of a wide valley, so that from its top the trees seemed to swell up all around like the edges of a great bowl, and he could not expect to see how far the forest lasted. Still he did not see this, and he climbed down full of despair. He got to the bottom at last, scratched, hot, and miserable, and he could not see anything in the gloom below when he got there. His report soon made the others as miserable as he was. The forest goes on forever and ever and ever in all directions. Whatever shall we do? And what is the use of sending a hobbit? They cried, as if it was his fault. They did not care tuppence about the butterflies and were only made more angry when he told them about the beautiful breeze, which they were too heavy to climb up and feel themselves. That night they ate their very last scraps of crumbs and food. The next morning when they awoke, the first thing they noticed was that they were still gnawingly hungry, and the next thing was that it was raining, and there was a drip of it dropping heavily on the forest floor. That only reminded them they were also parchingly thirsty. Without doing anything to relieve them, you cannot quite quench a terrible thirst by standing under giant oaks and waiting for a chance drip to fall on your tongue. The only scrap of comfort there was came unexpectedly from Bombur. He suddenly woke up and sat up, scratching his head. He could not make out where he was at all, nor why he felt so hungry, for he had forgotten everything that had happened since he started the journey that May morning long ago. The last thing he remembered was the party at the Hobbit's house, and they had great difficulty in making him believe their tale of all the many adventures they've had to this point. When he had heard that there was nothing to eat, he sat down and cried, for he felt very weak and wobbly in the legs. "Why did I ever wake up?" he cried. "I was having such beautiful dreams. I dreamed I was walking in a forest, rather like this one, only lit with torches on the trees and lamps swinging from the branches and fires burning on the ground. There was a great feast going on forever. A woodland king was there with a crown of leaves, and there was a merry singing, and I could not count or describe the things that there were to eat and drink." "You need not try," said Thorin. "In fact, if you can't talk about something else, you better be silent. We're quite annoyed enough with you as it is. If you hadn't woken up, we should have left you in your idiotic dreams in the forest. You are no joke to carry even after weeks of short commons." There was nothing now to be done but to be tightened the belts around the empty stomachs, and hoist their empty sacks and packs, and trudge through the track, without any hope of ever getting to the end, before they lay down and died of starvation. This they all did that day, going very slowly and wearily, while Bombur kept on, wailing that his legs would not carry him, that he wanted to lie down and sleep. "No, you don't," they said. "Let your legs take their share. We haven't carried you far enough." Okay. All the same, he suddenly refused to go a step further and flung himself to the ground. "Go on if you must," he said. "I'm just going to lie here and sleep and dream of food. If I can't get it any other way, I hope I never wake up again." At that moment, Balin, who was very little way ahead, cried out, "What was that? I thought I saw a twinkle light in the forest." They all looked, and the longish way off it seemed, they saw a red twinkle in the dark, then another and another sprang out beside them. Even Bombur got up, and they hurried along then, not caring if it was trolls or goblins. There was light in front of them and to the left of the path, and when they had drawn level with it, it seemed plain that torches and fires were burning under the trees, but a good way off their track. "It looks as if my dreams were coming true," gasped Bombur, puffing up behind. He wished to rush straight off into the woods after the lights, but the others remembered only too well the warnings of the wizard and of Bjorn. The feast would be no good if we never got back alive from it, said Thorn. But without a feast, we shan't remember alive much longer anyway, said Bombur, and Bilbo heartily agreed with him. They argued about it backwards and forward for a long while, until they agreed at length to send out a couple of spies to creep up near the lights to find out more about them. But then they could not agree on who was to be sent. I think we know where this is going. No one seemed anxious to run the chance of being lost and never finding his friends again. In the end, in spite of warnings, hunger decided them, because Bombur kept describing all the good things that they were being eaten, according to his dream, in the woodland feast. So they all left the path and plunged into the forest together. After a good deal of creeping and crawling, they peered round the trunks and looked into the clearing where some trees had felled to the ground level. There were many people there, elvish-looking folk, all dressed in green and brown, and sitting on sawn rings in the felled trees in a great circle. There was a fire in their midst, and there were torches fastened to some of the trees around and about. But most splendid sight of all, they were eating and drinking and laughing merrily. The smell of the roast meats was so enchanting that without waiting to consult one another, each one of them got up and scrambled forward into the ring with the one idea of begging for some food. No sooner had the first step into the clearing that all the lights went out as if by magic. Somebody kicked the fire up and the rockets of glittering sparks had vanished. They had light. They were lost in a complete lightless dark, and they could not even find one another, not for a long time at any rate. After blundering frantically in the gloom, falling over logs, bumping, crashing into trees, and shouting and calling till they must have wakened everything in the forest for miles, and they managed to gather themselves in a bundle and count themselves by a torch. By touch. Yeah, you. Okay, yeah, alright, yep, that'll do it. By the time they had, of course, quite forgotten what direction the path lay, and they were hopelessly lost, at least till morning. There was nothing for it to settle down for the night where they were. They did not dare to search on the ground for scraps of food, for fear of becoming separated again. But they had not been lying long. And Bilbo was only just getting drowsy when Dory, whose turn it was for first watch, said in a loud whisper, "The lights are coming out again over there, and there are more than ever before." Up they all jumped. Sure, there was enough. Not far away, there were scores of twinkling lights, and they had heard the voices and the laughter quite plainly. They crept slowly towards them in a single line, each touching the back of one in the front. When they got near Thorin and said, "No rushing forward this time. No one is to stir from hiding till I say. I shall send Mr. Baggins alone first to talk to them. They won't be frightened of him." What about me of them, thought Bilbo, and anyway, I hope they won't do anything nasty to him. When they got to the edge of the circle of light, they pushed Bilbo suddenly from behind. Before he had time to slip on his ring, he stumbled forward into the full blaze of the light of the torches. It was no good. Out went all the lights again, and complete darkness fell. If it had been difficult collecting themselves before, it was far worse this time, and they could not find the Hobbit. Every time they counted themselves and only made 13. They shouted and called, "Bilbo Baggins! Hobbit! You dreaded Hobbit! Hello, Hobbit! Confuscate you! Where are you?" And other things of that sort, but there was no answer. They were just giving up hope when Dory stumbled across him by sheer luck. In the dark, he fell over what he thought was a log, but he found it was a hobbit curled up fast asleep. It took a deal of shaking to wake him up, and when he was awake, he was not pleased at all. "I was having such a lovely dream," he grumbled, "all about having the most gorgeous of dinners." Good heavens, he has gone like Bombur," they said. "Don't tell us about dreams. Dream diners aren't any good, and we can't share them." "There they are, the best I am likely to get in this beastly place," he muttered, as he lay down beside the dwarves and tried to go back to sleep to find his dream again. But that was not the last of the lights of the forest. Later, when the night must have been getting old, Keely, who was watching, then came and roused them all again, saying, "There's a regular blaze of light beginning not far away. Hundreds of torches. Maybe fires must have been lit suddenly and by magic. And hark, the singing of the harps." After lying and listening for a while, they found they could not resist the desire to go near and try once more to get help. Up they got again, and this time the result was disastrous. The feast that they were now saw was greater and more magnificent than ever before, and at the head of a long line of feasters sat a woodland king with a crown of leaves upon his golden hair, very much like Bomber had described in his figurative dream. The elvish folk were passing bowls handed from hand and across the fires, and some were harping, and many were singing. Their gleaming hair was twined with flowers, green and white. Gems glinted in collars around their belts, and their faces with the songs were filled with mirth. Loud and clear was the fare were those songs, and out stepped Thorn into the mists. Dead silent fell in the middle of the world. Out went all the light. The fires leapt up in black smokes. Ashes and cinders were in their eyes of the dwarves, and the wood was filled again with the clamor and their cries. Bilbo found himself running around and around, as he thought, calling out the names: Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Fili, Keely, Bomber, Biffer, Bofer, Dwalin, Balin, Thorin, Oakenshield, while people he could not see or feel were doing the same all around him, with an occasional Bilbo thrown in. But the cries of the others were steadily and further and fainter. He thought after a while it seemed to him they changed to yells and cries for help in the far distance. All noise at last died right away, and he was left alone in complete silence and darkness. That was his most miserable of moments. But he made soon up his mind that it was no good trying to do anything until the day came with some little light, and quite useless to go blundering around, tiring himself out with no hope of any breakfast to revive him. So he sat himself down with his back to a tree, and not for the last time fell to thinking of far distant Hobbit hole with his beautiful pantries. He was deep in thought of bacon and eggs and toast with butter, and he felt something touch him. Something like a strong, sticky string was against his left hand, and when he tried to move, he found his legs were already wrapped in the same stuff, but that was when he got caught and he fell over. Then a great spider, who had been busy tying him up while he dozed, came from behind him and came at him. He could only see the thing's eyes, but he could feel its hairy legs, and it struggled to wind its abdomen thread around and around him. It was lucky he had come to his senses in time. Soon he could not have been able to move at all. He had a desperate fight before he got free. He beat the creature off with his hands. It was trying to poison him to keep him quiet, and small spiders do to flies, until he remembered his sword and drew it out. Then the spider jumped back, and he had time to cut his legs loose. After that, it was his turn to attack. The spider eventually did not use to such things carrying stingings at their side, or it would have been hurried away quicker. Bilbo came at it before it could disappear and stuck it with his sword in the right eye. Then it went mad and leaped and danced and flung out its legs in horrible jerks until he killed it with another stroke, and then he fell down and remembered nothing more for a little while. There was a usual dim gray light of the forest day about him when he came to his senses. The spider lay dead beside him, and his sword blade was stained black. Somehow the killing of the giant spider all alone by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves or anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person, and much fiercer and bolder in spite of an empty stomach, and he wiped his sword on the grass and put it back in its sheath. "I will give you a name," he said to it, and I shall name you Sting. Roxanne! No, not that Sting. Was that even Sting? Yes, it was. Kind of, I think. No, just shut up. Go with it. After that, he set out to explore. The forest was grim and silent, but obviously he had first to look for his friends, who were not likely to be very far off, unless they had made prisoners by the elves, or worse things. Bilbo felt it was unsafe to shout, and he stood a long while wondering what direction the path lay, and in the direction he would go and look for the dwarves. Oh, why did I not remember Bjorn's advice and Gandalf's, he lamented. What a mess we're in now. I only wish it was horrible being all alone. In the end, he made a good guess as he could in the direction for which the cries for help he had come into the night. And by luck, he was born with a good share of it. He guessed more or less right, as you will see. Having made up his mind, he crept along as cleverly as he could. Hobbits are clever at quietness, especially in the woods. I have already told you, Bilbo had slipped on his ring before he started. That is why the spiders neither saw nor heard him coming. He picked up his way stealthily, and some distance when he noticed the place of dense black shadow ahead of him. Black even for that forest, like a patch of midnight that had never been cleared away. And as he drew nearer, he saw that it made a spider web, one behind another, entangled with another. Suddenly he saw, too, that there were huge spiders and horrible sitting in the branches above him. Okay, go with it. And ring with him, no ring, he trembled for fear as they would discover him. Standing behind a tree, he watched a group of them for some time, and in the silence and stillness of the wood, he realized that these loathsome creatures were speaking to one another. Their voices were sort of thin, creaking and hissing, but he could make out many of the words they said. They were talking about the dwarves. "It was a sharp struggle, but worth it," he said. "One nasty thick skins, but to be sure, I'll wager there is good juice inside." "Aye, they'll make fine eating, and when they hung a bit," said another. "Don't hang 'em too long," said a third. "They're not as fat as they might be. Been feeding none of them well too as of late, I would guess." "Kill 'em, I say," hissed a fourth. "Kill 'em now and hang 'em dead for a while." "They're dead now, I'll warrant," said the first. "That they are not," said one, struggling just now, "just coming right around. I shouldn't say after a beautiful sleep. I'll show you." With that, one of the fat spiders ran along a rope until it came to a dozen bundles hanging in a row from a high branch. Bilbo was horrified, now that he had noticed them the first time, dangling in the shadows, to see a dwarvish foot sticking out at the bottom of some of the bundles, or here and there, the tip of a nose, or a bit of a beard, or a hood. To the fattest of these bundles the spider went. "It is poor old Bomber, I'll bet," thought Bilbo, and nipped hard at the nose that stuck out. There was a muffled yelp inside, and the toe shot up and kicked the spider straight and hard. This was life in Bomber still. There was a noise like the kicking of a flabby football, and the enraged spider fell off the branch, only catching itself with its own thread just in time. The others laughed. "You're quite right," they said. "The meat's alive and kicking." "I'll soon put an end to that," hissed the angry spider, climbing back onto its perch. Bilbo saw that he had the moment to come, that he must do something. He could not get up to the brutes, and he had nothing to shoot with, but looking around, he saw in that particular place there were many stones lying around, what appeared to be a now dry little watercourse. Bilbo was pretty fair shot with a stone, and it did not take him long to find a nice, smooth, egg-shaped one that fitted in his hand cozily. As a boy, he used to practice throwing stones at things until rabbits and squirrels and even birds got out of his way as quick as lightning if they saw him stoop. And even grown up, he had still spent a deal of his time dart throwing and shooting at the wand, bowls, nippets, and other quiet games of the aiming and throwing sort. Indeed, he could do lots of things besides blowing smoke rings, asking riddles, and cooking. That I haven't had time to tell you about. There was no time now. Okay. While he was picking up stones, the spider had reached Bomber, and soon he would have been dead. At that moment, Bilbo threw. The stone struck the spider pluck on the head, and it dropped senseless off the tree, flopped to the ground with all its legs curled up. The next stone went whizzing through a big web, snapping its cords and taking off the spider sitting in the middle of it. Whack! Dead. Then after all, there was deal commotion in the spider colony, and they forgot about the dwarves for a bit, I can tell you. They could not see Bilbo, but they could make out a good guess at the direction from which the stones were coming. And quick as lightning, they came running and swinging towards the hobbit, flinging out their long threads in all directions, so the air seemed full of waving snares. Bilbo, however, soon slipped away to a different place. The idea came to him to lead the furious spiders further and further away from the dwarves, if he could, to make them curious, excited, and angry all at once. And when about 50 had gone off to the place where he had stood before, he threw more stones at these and others that had stopped behind. Then, dancing among the trees, he began to sing a song to infuriate them and bring them all after him, and soon let the dwarves hear his voice. "Oh, fat spider, spinning in a tree, oh, fat spider, can't see me. Attercop, won't you stop? Stop your spinning and look at me." More singing. Old Tom Noddy, all big body. Old Tom Noddy, can't spy me. Attercop, down you drop. You'll never catch me up your tree. Not very good, perhaps. Then you must remember that he had to make it up himself on the spur at a very awkward moment. It did what he wanted anyway. He sang and he threw up more stones and stamped. Practically all the spiders in the place came after him. Some dropped to the ground, others raced along the branches, swung from tree to tree, or cast new ropes across the dark spaces. They made for his noise far quicker than he expected. They were rightfully angry. Quite apart from the stones, no spider had ever been called Attercop, and tomnoodery, of course, is insulting to anybody. Sure. Off Bilbo scuttled to a fresh place, but several of the spiders had run now to different points of the glade where they had lived, and they were busy spinning webs across all the spaces between the tree stems. Soon, the hobbit would be caught in a thick fence of them all. At that least the spider's idea. Standing now in the middle of this hunting and spinning insects, Bilbo plucked up his courage and began a new song. "Lazy lob and crazy cob are weaving webs to wind me, as far more sweet than other meat, but they still cannot find me." He rhymed me with me. "Here I am, naughty little fly. Here you are fat and lazy. You cannot trap me, though you try, in other cobwebs crazy." With that, he turned and found the last spare between two tall trees had closed with a web, but luckily not a proper web, only strands a double thick rope spider had run hastily backward and forward from trunk to trunk. Out came his little sword. He slashed the threads to pieces and off went singing. The spiders saw the sword, though. I don't suppose they knew what it was at once that the whole lot of them came hurrying after the hobbit along the ground and the branches, hairy legs waving, nippers and spitting, sapping, eyes popping, full of froth and rage. They followed him into the forest until Bilbo had gone far as he had dared. Then, quieter than a mouse, he stole back. He had precious little time, he knew, before the spiders were disgusted and came back to their trees where the dwarves were hung. In the meanwhile, he had to rescue them. The worst part of the job was getting up onto the long branch where the bundles were dangling. I don't suppose he would have managed it if a spider had not luckily left a rope hanging down. With its hope, though it stuck to his hand and hurt him, he scrambled up, only to meet an old, slow, wicked, fat-bodied spider who had remained behind to guard the prisoners. It had been busy pinching them to see which was the juiciest to eat. It had thought the starting the feast while the others were away, but Mr. Baggins was in a hurry, and before the spider knew what was happening, it felt his sting and rolled off the branch dead. Bilbo's next job was to lose a dwarf. What he was to do? If he was to cut the string that hung him, the wretched dwarf would tumble thump to the ground in a good way below. Wriggling along the branch would make all the poor dwarves dance and dingle like ripe grapefruit. He reached the first bundle. Feely, or Keely, he thought, by the tip of the blue hood sticking out of the top. Most likely Feely, he thought, by the tip of the long nose pointing out through the winding threads. He managed by leaning over and cut most of the storing string off. Threads that bound him around and round, and then, sure enough, with a kick and a struggle, most Feely emerged. I'm afraid Bilbo actually laughed at the sight of him jerking his arms stiff and legs as he danced on with the spider string under his armpits, just like the ones from the funny toys bobbing on a wire. Somehow or another, Feely got onto the branch, and then he did his best to help the hobbit, although he was feeling very sick and ill from spider poison, from hanging most of the night, and the next day wound round with only his nose to breathe through. It took him ages to get the beastly stuff out of his eyes and eyebrows, and for his beard, he had to cut most of it off. Well, between them and started to haul up the first one dwarf and another to slash them free, none of them were better off than Feely, and some were far worse. Some had hardly been able to breathe at all. Long noses are sometimes useful, you see, and some had been more poisoned than others. On his way to rescue Keely, Biffer, Bofer, Dory, and Nori, poor Bomber was so exhausted, he was the fattest and had been constantly pinched and poked, that he just rolled off the branch and fell plop to the ground, fortunately on the leaves that lay there, and there were still 5 dwarves hanging at the end of the branch where the spiders came back, more full of rage than ever. Bilbo immediately went to the end of the branch nearest the tree trunk and crept back to those crawling up. He had taken off his ring when he rescued Feely and forgot to put it on again, so now they all began to splutter and hiss. "Now we see you, you nasty little creature. We will eat you and leave your bones and skin hanging on a tree." "Ugh, he's got a sting, has he? Well, we get him all the same, and then we'll hang him and head downwards for a day or two." While this was going on, the other dwarfs were working on the rest of their captives and cutting all the threads with their knives. Soon all would be free, though it was not clear what had happened after that. The spiders had caught them pretty easily the night before, and they had been unaware in the dark. This time they were looking like horrible battle. Suddenly, Bilbo noticed that some of the spiders had grabbed around old Bomber on the floor and had tried to hang him up again, were dragging him away. He gave a shout and slashed at the spiders in front of him. They quickly gave way and scrambled and fell right down the tree in the middle of those in the ground. His little sword was something new in the way of stings for them. How it darted to and fro. It shone with delight as he stabbed at them. 6 were killed before the rest drew off and left Bomber to Bilbo. Come down, he shouted to the dwarves on the branches. "Don't stay up there and be netted." For he saw spiders swarming up in all the neighboring trees and crawling down round the boughs around the heads of the dwarves. Down the dwarves scrambled and jumped or dropped, 11 all in the heap, most of them very shaky and little on their legs. Then they were at last, 12 of them, counting poor old Bomber, who was still being propped up on either side of his cousin Biffer and his brother Bofer. And Bilbo was dancing about and waving his sting, and hundreds of angry spiders were goggling at him all around, about and above. It looked pretty hopeless. Then the battle began. Some of the dwarves had knives and some had sticks, and all of them could get at stones, and Bilbo had his elvish dagger. Again and again the spiders were beaten off, and many of them were killed, but it could not go on for long. Bilbo was nearly tired out. Only 4 of the dwarves were able to stand at this point, and soon they would all be overpowered like weary flies. Already the spiders were beginning to weave their webs all around them again, from tree to tree. In the end, Bilbo could think of no plan to except to let the dwarves into the secret of the ring. He was rather sorry about it, but he could not be helped. "I am going to disappear," he said. "I shall draw the spiders off if I can. If you must, keep together and make it to the opposite direction, to the left, where there's more or less the way towards the place where we last saw the elf fires." It was difficult to get them to understand, what with their dizzy heads and their shouts, but the whacking of sticks and the throwing of stones, and the last Bilbo felt he could delay no longer. The spiders were drawing a circle ever closer. He suddenly slipped on his ring, and to great astonishment the dwarves, he vanished. Soon there came a loud sound of "Lazy Lob" and "Uttercob" from among the trees to the right. That upset the spiders. They stopped advancing, and some went off in the direction of the voice. Uttercup made them so angry they lost their wits. Then Balin, who grasped Bilbo's plan better than the rest, led an attack. The dwarves huddled together in a knot, and sending a shower of stones, they drove at the spiders on the left and burst through a ring. Anyway, behind them now, the shouting and singing suddenly stopped. Hoping desperately that Bilbo had not been caught, the dwarves went on. Not fast enough, though. They were sick and weary, and could not go much further than a hobble and a wobble, though they might have had spiders close behind. Even now they had nowhere to turn and fight the creatures that they were overtaking them. And some spiders were in the trees above them and throwing down long curling threads. Things were looking pretty bad when suddenly Bilbo reappeared and charged into the astonished spiders unexpectedly from the side. Go on, he shouted. "I will do the stinging." And he did. He darted backwards and forwards, slashing at spider threads, hacking at their legs, and stabbing at their fat bodies if any spider came too near. The spiders swelled with rage. The sputtering and froth, the hissing and horrible curses, but they had become mortally afraid of Sting and dared not come near, now that it had come back. So curse as they would, their prey moved slowly but steadily away. It was a most terrible business and seemed like to take hours. But the last they went, and Bilbo felt he could not lift his hand for a single more stroke. The spiders suddenly gave it up, and followed them no more, but went back to disappointing in their own dark colony. Alright. The dwarves had noted they had come to where the edge of the ring where elf fires had been, where it was one of those they had seen the night before. They could not tell. It seemed that they were a good magic lingered in such spots where the spiders did not like. At any rate, there was light. It was greener, and the boughs less thick and threatening. They had a chance to rest and draw their breath. There they lay for some time, puffing and panting, but very soon they began to ask questions. They had to have the whole vanishing business carefully explained, and the finding of the ring intensified them so much for a while they forgot their own troubles. Balin in particular insisted on having the Gollum story, riddles and all, told all over again, with the ring in its proper place. But after a time the light began to fail, and then questions were asked. Where were they, and where was their path, and where was there any food, and what were they going to do next? These questions they were asked over and over again, and it was from little Bilbo that they seemed to expect to get all the answers. From which you can see they had great change of opinions of Mr. Baggins very much, and become to have a great respect for him, as Gandalf said they would. Indeed, they had really expected him to think of some wonderful plan for helping them, and they were not merely grumbling. They knew only too well that they would all soon have been dead if they had not been for the little hobbit. They had thanked him many times. Some of them even got up and bowed right to the ground before him, though they fell over with the effort and could not get on their legs again for some time. Knowing the truth about vanishing did not lessen the opinion of Bilbo at all, for they all saw that he had some wits as well as luck and a magic ring, and all three very useful possessions. In fact, they praised him so much that Bilbo began to feel really was something of a bold adventure about him after all, though he would have felt a lot bolder still if he had anything to eat. Still, there was nothing at all, and none of them were able to go and look for anything or search for the lost path. The lost path. No idea where it came to Bilbo's tired head. He just sat around staring in front of him at the endless trees, and after a while, they all fell silent again. All except Balin. Long after the others had stopped talking and shut their eyes, he kept muttering and chuckling to himself. Gollum. Well, I'm blessed. So that's how he sneaked past me, is it? Now I know. Just creep quietly along, you ditty, Mr. Baggins. Buttons all over the doorstep. Good old Bilbo. Bilbo. Bo. And then he fell asleep, and there was complete silence for a long while. All of a sudden, Dwalin opened an eye and looked around for them and said, "Where's Thorin?" It was a terrible shock. Of course, there were only 13 of them, 12 dwarves and a hobbit. Where, indeed, was Thorin? They wondered what evil fate had befallen him, magic or dark monsters, and shuddered off as they lay in the forest. Then they dropped off one by one in uncomfortable sleep and horrible dreams that everything wore to black night, and there were must-leaves for the present, too sick and weary to set guard or take turns at watching. Besides, it's pitch black. What are you gonna, okay, nothing. Go back to sleep. Thorin had been caught much faster than they had. You remember Bilbo falling like a log into sleep as he stepped into the circle of light. The next time it had been Thorin who stepped forward, and the lights were out as he fell like a stone enchanted. All the noise of the dwarves lost in the light. Their cries as the spiders caught them and bound them, and all the sounds of the battle the next day had passed from over her unheard, when the wood elves had come to him and bound him and carried him away. The feasting people were wood elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is to distrust strangers, though their magic was strong. Even in those days, they were very wary. They differed from the high elves of the West, and were more dangerous and less wise. For most of them, together with their scattered relations in hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to ferry in the West. There the light elves and the deep elves and the sea elves went and lived for ages, and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and the cunning craft and the making of beautiful and marvelous things, before some came back into the wide world. In the wide world, the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved the best of stars, and they wandered in the great forests that grew tall in the lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over to open lands in moonlight and starlight. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the glorious and the dark. Still, elves they were and remain, that is, the good people. It's a long explanation of elves. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood, it is the eastern side that lived on this time the greatest of the king. Before his huge doors a river ran out of the heights of the forest, and flowed on and out the marshes to the feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from countless smaller ones, opened out into every wound far underground, and many passages and many halls. It was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous, in fact, that the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the grounds and the branches. The beeches were their favorite trees, the king's cave in his place, in the stronger place of its treasure, and the forests of his people against their enemies. It was also the dungeon of the prisons. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was an enemy. In ancient days it had been wars in some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It was only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the elven king had a weakness for his treasure, especially foreign and silver and white gems, he thought his hoard was rich. He was ever eager for more. since he had not yet a great treasure as other elf lords of old. His people neither mined nor worked metals or jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with tilling the earth. All this was known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had come nothing to do with the old quarrel I spoke of. Unlike the movie. Consequently, Thorin was angered at the treatment of him, and they took the spell off of him, and he came to his senses. And also he was determined that no word of gold or jewels should be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly on Thorin. When he was brought before him, he asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say that he was starving. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking?" asked the king. "We did not attack them," asked Thorin. "We came to beg because we are starving." "Where are your friends now, and what are they doing?" "I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest." "What are you doing in the forest?" "Looking for food and drink, because we are starving." "But what brought you into the forest at all?" asked the king angrily. And that Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away and keep him safe until he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him and shut him in one of the inmost caves with the strongest wood doors, and left him. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, if not very fine. The wood elves were not goblins, and were reasonably well behaved, even to their worst enemies, when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things that they had no mercy upon. There in the king's dungeon, poor Thorin lay, and after he had gotten over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belonged to the next chapter, and the beginning of another adventure, in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness. That, I think, was the longest chapter so far, Chapter 8. Next time we got Chapter 9, Barrels Out of the Bound. This is another favorite chapter of mine that we'll go over it together if the movie did it justice or not. I honestly think the movies did a really fair job of telling the story in the book. Yes, they added in like a whole bunch of extra stuff, but people gave Peter Jackson a lot of flack for taking stuff out of Lord of the Rings to make 3 movies, and then he puts in extra stuff and people gave him flack. Well, you put in too much stuff. Like, well, what do you want? I thought it was great. I thought the movies were really good. I didn't have a problem with them. I thought they were true to the book. They were true to the side projects that they included in, but this video has gone way long. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in, jumped out, whatever. We're all in this together. We're all having fun doing our thing and just partying, and I don't know what this voice is, but maybe next time I shouldn't put vodka in my drink. Made it more interesting, that's for sure. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I have been averaging 6 nights a week, 5 nights at least. Today is a Monday. I'm gonna see if I can go 5 more nights, at least 5 more nights. So again, thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time.